You have landed on The Substance. I'm your host, Trevor Aiken, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts, Philip Marinello.
Hey, guys.
And Vincent Edwards.
Hey, how's it going?
We have a special episode for you guys today with a lot of great content, so we're going to jump right into it. Joining us today is author, director of the Public Religion Research Institute, Robert P. Jones, and he is the author of White Too Long, a recent book about the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Oh, yeah, great. Well, I'm happy to be here.
One of the reasons why we wanted to bring this to our listeners is on The Substance, we want to be thinking through things biblically. And I read an article by Robbie earlier in the year in The Atlantic, and I just immediately connected because I'm like, this is a story about my faith tradition, about the conservative kind of churches I grew up in. And this book kind of documents ways in which we have failed to really live up to some of the ideals that we are talking about. So, Robbie, for me, the issue of like the church and racism came up at first during seminary, reading Revival and Revivalism. And I wondered, how did we go from the Second Great Awakening to the rending of churches and nation in just a few decades? And I'm wondering for you, how did your journey to understand the conservative white church's role in race and racism start?
Yeah, well, look, I should say first, I'm Christian. I grew up in Mississippi, the group Southern Baptist, and my family has been Southern Baptist for generations. And in fact, I've inherited down through my mom's side our family Bible from 1815 that goes back into Middle Georgia, Twiggs County, Bibb County. It tells the story of, there's Baptist pastors all the way, back into the 1830s, and along with Confederate soldiers, and others along the way. And so, I'm kind of steeped in this world. I grew up very active in church. I was that kid. I was at church. My family and I were at church like literally 5 days a week. And, the kind of Southern Baptist rhythm of things, that's entirely possible. Monday night visitation, Tuesday night Bible study, Wednesday night Bible study, and 3 times a day on Sunday. So, yeah, I was there. But like you mentioned seminary. It wasn't until I was in seminary myself, and I went to a Baptist college, then I went to a Baptist seminary. I have an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth. It wasn't until I was in seminary and in my early 20s, that I really heard anything about this very fraught, history of the denomination. And in my case, it being Southern Baptist, the denomination was formed explicitly over the issue of slavery and over the question of whether clergy and specifically missionaries could own slaves and be in good standing as a member of the clergy and as a Christian. And Northern Baptists rejected that notion. And when they did, Baptists in the South kind of took their toys and went home and decided that we thought it was perfectly consistent with the gospel to own other human beings. And that was the beginning of the denomination's roots. And by the middle of the 20th century, that denomination became the largest Protestant denomination of any kind in the country.
Mm-hmm. So how do you go from kind of that background, which you have a lot of independent Bible-believing churches, the Bible church movement kind of stuff that has a lot of similar doctrines and beliefs to Southern Baptists, though not maybe officially being Southern Baptist. But being in that environment, what was the start for you where you're like, wait a second, what's going on here? So much so that now you're the director of a research institute that very much is helping shed light on some of these things.
Yeah. Well, look, it's been a journey. That was my early 20s. This book is coming out in my 52nd year. So it's literally been a 3 decades long journey of kind of sorting this out, taking a step, and just kind of putting the pieces together. And I think that's been one of the things I hope that the book will do. Is this is not at all a book of, some outsider throwing rocks, but, the first sentence in the book has the word I in it. The last sentence in the book has the word us in it. And, so I'm very much writing as someone who cares about the church and cares about Christianity. And particularly as someone who's a father of 2 kids, weighs on me very heavily what kind of faith I'm going to hand down to them and that I don't want to hand down a faith that is as tangled up with racism and white supremacy as the faith that I inherited. And I could say that from, that happened with me, even with parents who made some who were very intentional about trying to put some distance between the Jim Crow South and my brother and sister and I. And even so, I think the challenge is the theology. It stopped being acceptable to use the N-word. It stopped being acceptable to, as Ross Barnett did, when he ran in the 1960s on an explicitly segregationist platform, for governor in Mississippi. He would be on the stump and he would say things like, "Look, God was the original segregationist." Like, that's a direct quote from the stump speech. And then he would go to First Baptist Jackson, where he was the head of the men's Sunday school program, and he was an honored and revered member. Now I think today that's not exactly the case. There's very few places that would tolerate that today, but the theology that justified that, there's been very little reform and very little shift in looking at our hymns, our hymnals, our liturgy, all of which were shaped around this presupposition that white people were to be in a superior position, and believe that not just kind of as a matter of culture, but believe that as a matter of theology and divine mandate.
Yeah,
man. I'm curious. So we have listeners, a lot of folks who are in that, like yourself, like just the person sitting in the pew, attending church, reading Bible, going to Bible study, not like irreligious people, but people relatively engaged. When they think about these things or hear those statements on the surface, like they'd be like, no, like why would, like, that's not Christian. Like the Bible wouldn't tolerate racism, let alone like be complicit in it. So
even more than
could you talk a little bit about, again, the nature of your research and some of the things that you have found in history and kind of how that works its way forward in time?
Yeah, well, as I try to do in the book, I try to keep this pretty personal. If I go back and look at the parent church of the church that eventually my parents grew up in, that's First Baptist of Macon, Georgia. The origin of that church, it started in the 1820s, and it was actually a mixed race church, but it was slave owners bringing enslaved people to church with them. And they would hear a sermon, from a white pastor preached to this joint congregation. Now, if we really take that seriously, and I think it's one of the things that I appreciate about conservative and Orthodox Christians is that, theology matters, right? I mean, you have to take it kind of seriously, and liturgy matters and hymns matter. These are all things that form us. They shape what we see as relevant to our faith and what we see as irrelevant to our faith. And the challenge, I think, is that in that setting, if you ask very seriously, what kind of sermons could get preached in a setting like that? What kind of hymns could get sung? What sort of scripture would get read and not read? So I'm thinking, you get a lot of Ephesians, slaves, obey your masters, probably not about Galatians 3, where there is no slave nor free, no Jew nor Greek. You probably get the 10 Commandments out of Exodus, but probably not a lot of the Israelites being freed from bondage out of Exodus. So these things are back there. And then, what I do in the book is sort of try to take that history seriously, and then look at some contemporary public opinion data to see, well, what does it look like if you compare the attitudes of white Christians, particularly, and I take as a comparative group, white Americans who claim no religious affiliation. Like how do Christians stack up on issues of systemic racism? And the picture's not very pretty. Basically, what the data shows is that one of the things that Christianity seems to do for whites is to limit their ability to see particularly systemic racism. And that is things that are institutional. And that's really the most powerful forms of racism are the policies, that prevent people from having certain jobs or living in certain neighborhoods, or that generate unequal outcomes in the criminal justice system or in policing. And so one of the things I did is I created an index of attitudes around systemic racism, and I used 15 different questions. And when I combined those questions together and kind of put them on a composite scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being holding kind of more racist attitudes, 1 being holding less racist attitudes. White Christians basically scored between 7 and 8 toward the high end of holding more racist attitudes. White non-Christians scored 4, and African Americans scored 2. So if you ask the question today, who's the closest to African American views about issues of systemic racism, it's not white Christians. It's whites who have no claim to any sort of religious faith. And to me, I think if we think seriously about commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves, that is kind of one of the central commandments, as the New Testament says it is. And we see our African American brothers and sisters upset and dismay and pain and angry, and we're not able to sit with that long enough to take that seriously, something has gone seriously awry. And the data seems to show us that. It seems to, in many ways, actually, that the work of Christianity on white consciences is actually the opposite of what you would think it would be. And instead of enlivening our moral sensibilities and broadening our sense of empathy, it actually serves, as Martin Luther King, kind of named this in the 1960s, this great piece that he wrote called Letter from Birmingham Jail. And he says, who are these white Christians, right, who claim to be followers of Jesus and still sit safely behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows? And I think he's pretty on target with what even the contemporary, 50 years later, what the nearly 60 years later, what the contemporary data seems to show is that you take an average white person, you add Christianity, and they move further, not closer, to the concerns of African Americans.
Yeah. And so Robbie, I'm Black, and I read your book, and it was just tough to hear this because there are men that I look up to as a Christian who I'm hearing about either for the first time or in a new way, that their resume just doesn't look great. Their relationship between racism and American conservative church. So what would you say to people of color who read your content and who are Christians who want to know more about this and have a hard time getting through it?
Yeah. Look, I'll say I'm right there with you. And this was the hardest thing I've ever written. It was something I struggle with. I'm just to be honest, frequently in tears at the keyboard as I was writing, just because the truth was so hard. But I have tried very hard not to flinch. And again, doing that not, I think, out of a spirit of destroying something, but I do think out of Proverbs, it's kind of faithful are the wounds of a friend, that there's a reform that we've never done. And I remember I wrote a letter to my parents because I knew it was going to be a painful read to my parents. And what came to mind there is I went in my 20s to visit Dachau and concentration camp in Germany. And as I looked at the way that Germans have handled the Holocaust, the whole Nazi episode, there's not denial, there's documentation, there's confession, there's lament, and there's been a real effort to kind of, repair the damage, and sort things out. And it's so painful to me to realize that there's been hardly any of that work done in white Christianity with relationship to its support for slavery, and white supremacy and segregation. And so, I guess back to your question, it's difficult. I don't know what to say. My first response is just to say, look, I hope to be patient with us as we try to start telling the truth. That hopefully if we can tell the truth, I think it was a great line by James Baldwin that, not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that, that's, I think the moment we're at is a truth-telling moment. And it's only after we tell the truth can we even begin to figure out, how to take some steps along the pathway to make things right. And I have urging kind of white Christians in the book too, to not try to reach too quickly to their African American friends and people in their community and ask for forgiveness and reconciliation, but to sort of stay with the work of repair and the work of justice, and trust that reconciliation will come as an outgrowth of that work. I think the great temptation is for white, because it's so uncomfortable and painful, right, to tell the truth. You want to get out of that position as quickly as you can. But I think we have to do more than that. As a white Christian community, we have to kind of think about hard. Okay, we did all this damage for centuries. We got our own internal work to do, but we also have external, work of repair to do. And, let's just keep doing that work of repair and thinking about justice. And I think we can trust our African American brothers and sisters to tell us when we're reconciled, right? Once we've done that work. So I kind of don't think we've got much to say other than to say we're gonna try to tell the truth. We're gonna try to be honest about the past and the present, and we're gonna try to fix it. And hopefully you can walk with us on that journey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In your book, you reference the response to, in the 90s, the Southern Baptist Convention's apology from Reverend Arlie Griffin Jr., who said, "It is only when one's request for forgiveness is reflected in a change of attitude and actions that the victim can then believe that the request for forgiveness is authentic." And I thought that was super biblical and powerful and really meaningful. I don't think any sincere believer would really disagree with that sentiment. I want to talk mostly about the history, but while we're on also the kind of racism index, I'm thinking of someone who says, well, how do you know that your index doesn't just, really sort out who's liberal or really sort out who's, maybe it's just an issue of labels, because really I know Christians and they're not racist and they're not, hating their fellow man. And so, but when you talk about this systemic stuff with the police and all that kind of stuff, like that's getting into some liberal ideas. What would you say to someone who kind of has that attitude about your research?
Yeah. Well, I would say that some of the best white Christian defense mechanisms are to call something political or to call something liberal.
True.
Yeah.
And I say that, like, again, I say that out of personal experience, right? The defensiveness, I think, is not surprising. But I do think, like, for self-awareness and growth, if we realize that, like, one of our favorite tools has been to call something political or to call it liberal, and that just with a sweep of the hand dismisses, it rather than taking it seriously, I'd say I'd start there. Let's unpack it a little more. And then I do think the thing that, for me, kind of cuts through all of that better than anything else is to ask, where are African American Christians on this question? And if they are somewhere drastically different than we are, then I think the question is why. And I think that the easy answer to that question is not because African Americans are liberal, but I think the real question is, like, what is it in their experience that gives them a different perspective on this than me, and why am I so quickly likely to dismiss this? Whether we're talking about Confederate monuments and flags, or whether we're talking about criminal justice reform, or whether we're talking about treatment by police. I mean, even the pandemic, right, has really just pulled the lid off of these great inequalities in our society. And we have African Americans and Latinos getting infected and dying at twice the rate of whites. And so, like, why is that? So clearly they have a sort of different experience. And I think taking that really seriously, it's really a matter of empathy at the end of the day. And I think letting go of arrogance and opening oneself up for empathy. And I think that's one of the most deeply Christian things we can do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Robbie, some Christians who would be listening to this, they would object with what you're saying by saying that, sure, some people in the past were racist, but that indicates nothing about our faith or the way we live it now. And so how does your research interact with that?
Yeah. Well, I think this is where the contemporary data really helps. Just to give you an example, something that's been so troubling on the news all summer is the police killing of African Americans. And so we've actually asked about this on public opinion surveys, and It's one of the questions that I use in this racism index that I developed in the book. But if you just take that one question out, question reads like this: do you think that the killing of unarmed African American men by police, do you think they are isolated incidents, or do you think that they are part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans? Now, overwhelming majorities of African Americans say the second thing, right, that they're part of a pattern. So we have a testimony from African Americans about their own lives on this question. But again, when you ask about where white Christians are on this question, they are more than 2 to 1 the other direction, saying that, no, these are just isolated incidents. They don't connect the dots. And again, whites who don't claim any religious faith at all are much closer to African Americans on this question. And again, I still think it kind of goes back to just a really basic question of love, right? And this kind of idea of loving our neighbor. And at the very least, loving our neighbor, I think, should be about having enough humility that when our African American brothers and sisters are telling us something about their own lives and about their own experiences that, you know, we white Christians haven't really had to deal with in the same way, that we really ought to at least have the humility to listen and to sit with it long enough to figure out what it's about without a kind of, you know, arrogant and quick retort of all lives matter or blue lives matter, or, you know, just kind of a dismissal or a tit for tat kind of response here. And I think particularly given that the historical record is so clear, that we're only one generation off of most white Christians defending Jim Crow and segregation. And given that we're only one generation off from that, and that we got it so wrong, I mean, this also ought to fund a great deal of humility, you know, on our part, and a great deal, I think, of openness to trying to understand something that may not even make sense to us at first glance. But if we hear this loud testimony from African American Christians on this, I think we ought to just sit with it, you know, and to figure out what's going on, and to probably start with the presupposition that we're just missing something.
Yeah, no,
that's solid.
That makes sense. You know, as I was reading your work, I know you mentioned Michael Emerson's work in Divided by Faith. He kind of posits this idea of the cultural toolkit. And so I was wondering, like, as you're kind of thinking through this issue and kind of working through the research and the history, is that what you find? Is it a cultural toolkit, or is there something more going on?
Yeah, I think it's a great metaphor. It actually comes from a sociologist named Ann Swidler. And then what Emerson does there is take it and kind of put it in the theological, you know, context. It's a great metaphor, though, I think, for every theological system is a lens for seeing the world. And so by their very nature, as a lens does or a toolkit does, there are certain things it's good at doing and certain things it's not good at doing. And one of the things that Emerson talks about is individualism, you know, as one of the key components there. And I don't know about you guys, but I mean, if there was anything I heard, it was something about having a personal relationship with Jesus, right? That I heard virtually every service. What's notable about that, though, is that taken by itself, if that becomes the kind of beginning and the end of religion, it does lead one to kind of having these kind of moral blinders on in some ways to the social justice claims or the systemic justice issues that sit outside those stained glass windows, right? That if it's me and Jesus and our relationship is good, then nothing else really matters, right, in terms of being faithful. Now, that's, I think, to my mind, a very unbiblical and a sort of like narrowly way of thinking about what a biblical faith looks like. I mean, it doesn't take the book of James seriously, doesn't take the prophets seriously. And I think that's one of the challenges, though. But what I think the thing that I've kind of added to Emerson's work here, and I'm heavily indebted to this really great groundbreaking work in Divided by Faith, is to kind of connect it up to the history and to ask the question, well, why is it then? Why did it develop that way? And the disturbing answer that I've come to is that it developed that way kind of by necessity, right? Because if that setting that I described earlier is a kind of normative setting in the early seedbed of the Republic, That's what Christianity looks like. The question it can't really, or what it doesn't really question for the most part, is this idea that there's a racial hierarchy, and that whites are divinely intended to be at the top of that racial hierarchy. And that's actually part of they have a special role, so kind of paternalistic role in quote unquote civilizing non-white people. This drove the entire missionary enterprise. It drove Western expansion. It justified the genocide of indigenous people and forcibly removing them from land. This is behind all of it, right? Is this divine justification that ultimately whites are intended to be there, and ultimately they're going to civilize everyone else. But that's a very troubling premise around which to build all the theology. But if that is your premise, you need something like a way of allowing white consciences to be okay with themselves, even in the middle of all kinds of injustice like slavery coexisting literally in the pew behind you.
Yeah, reading some of, I think it was particularly chapter 2, where you describe a particularly brutal public execution on a Sunday morning, literally with folks who just got out of church. Like that was particularly hard to read for me.
Yeah, they were handing out postcards after a lynching, and then they were handing out postcards and little coins. They just struck little commemorative coins for the lynching, and on one of them it had Easter sacrifice, printed on it.
Oh, Lord.
Robbie, so you're saying like if that is the environment where folks are, and that is your baseline culturally, and then you have your theological and your religious and your spiritual training alongside that, we naturally tend to think that like my reality is good. And if I'm getting the Bible, but I happen to be in this thing, it can be easy, like you said, with blinders, it can be easy not to be self-reflective and self-critical when it comes to those sorts of things.
I think that's right. And I think the reason why it's so powerful is because it's actually designed to do that, right? It's designed to render these other very problematic questions invisible. I think about it sometimes like, if you think about a vine that's kind of grown up around a tree, and the tree dies, right, and falls away. That vine is still shaped and kind of has been disfigured by its necessity of growing around this tree. And I think in some ways that's the situation that white American Christianity is in, is that much of the overt, you're going to be hard pressed to find a Christian that will, although it's not impossible. I've seen, things this year of white evangelicals justifying slavery, right? Even calling it a necessary evil, like still not just denouncing it. So that's still there. But I still think you'd be hard pressed to find a lot of defenders of that. You'd be hard pressed to find a lot of defenders of segregation, segregated schools, even though that was only 50 years ago. But
that was not in the distant past.
And it's not de jure anymore, but it's still de facto.
Yeah. And, just little things like, all of these private Christian academies, that suddenly grew up in the late 60s and early 70s. There were like all of a sudden quadruple the number of them that there were, say, in the 1940s. And no one talked at the time really overtly about what they were about, right? And they're obviously essentially segregation academies. They were places for white students to abandon the public schools so they wouldn't have to go to school with African Americans. But there just hasn't been much reckoning, right, with this not very distant past at all.
And I think going back to the history, because I think the history is one of the biggest barriers to that. We have this story that really surrounds our self-conception. Someone like Basil Manley Sr., none of us have heard of this guy, but we think about the great books about Robert E. Lee, and, we think about this genteel man who, maybe this guy didn't really support segregation. He loved his country. He just loved his state. And so he was
got roped into it.
Yeah. And fighting for his community. And so we kind of identify with this as kind of the quintessential Christian man. But maybe even more Southern Baptists at the time would have identified with Basil Manley Sr. Can you talk a little bit about who he was?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's just unbelievable that even after going, so I didn't hear anything about him even in seminary. So I was only doing the kind of spade work, historical spade work for this book that I even became aware of him. But he's probably the most influential theologian and church leader, and certainly in Baptist life you've never heard of. Mm-hmm. So he was the president at the University of Alabama. He was the founder of Southern Seminary, the oldest, first and oldest seminary in among Southern Baptists. He was the architect of that split that we talked about between Southern and Northern Baptists in 1845, and kind of helped stitch together the idea of a new Southern Baptist convention. And he was one of the most well-known preachers justifying slavery. And in fact, he became so endeared to Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy that he really became known as the chaplain to the Confederacy. And for example, he was like when Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as the first president of the Confederacy in Montgomery, there were three people in a stagecoach pulling up, and it was the new president, the vice president, and Basil Manley Sr. And he was the guy holding the Bible as Jefferson Davis took the oath of office, and who gave this long, flowery prayer, calling on God to bless the Confederate States of America as God's model, kind of best model for human civilization. So he goes on. He's the president of Southern Seminary for 10 years, which was founded as a seminary that would train up pastors that would be fit for serving churches in the Confederacy. That is to say that they would be very well equipped to defend in the name of Christianity the practice of slavery.
Wow. Man. And they were not unacquainted with the idea that slavery was wrong, or that chattel slavery as practiced in America was certainly unbiblical, but they disagreed, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he debated, abolitionists, and there was no shortage of connection to those abolitionist arguments. And he very clearly made the argument that the plain reading of the Bible and a literal reading of the Bible. Here's the thing. I mean, there's places he can go to do that, right? In the biblical text. And that's what he did. And just made this argument that this was the normative view. And if you read his sermons, you listen to his prayers on these occasions, it was very much tied into this idea that, this way of life in the South that included slavery, this very hierarchical racial model was the pinnacle in many ways. So America was the promised land, and in particular, the Confederate expression of America was the way that God actually intended to bring the country forward and really to be a model for the rest of the world.
Wow. And it today is obviously a very, very prominent seminary. Boyce College is there as well, and we have several friends who go there and received a good education there. But do you think that is the leadership aware of this history of these founders and some of these name-bearing people on the school?
Yeah, they just 2 years ago undertook, to their credit, undertook a study of this, but then they didn't quite fully get there. So they produced a report, but the report focused on the 4 founding faculty members of the seminary, of whom Basil Manley's son was one. So there's a Manley Hall, for example, on Southern Seminary. I believe it's named after the son. John Broadus is another name. And the huge Baptist publishing company that published the hymnals today, Broadman, is a combination of John Broadus's name and Basil Manley's name, Broadman. Wow. That still bears, those, all of whom were slave owners, and justified slavery in the name of Christianity. But it focused on those 4 founding faculty members and really only had a very small mention of Basil Manley Sr., But Basil Manley Sr. is certainly the more complicated and difficult figure compared to his son and his fellow faculty members. So, but that's where they focused on. But it turned out it was a report. They put it out, but then very little changed. There was no action really at the end of it. So there was kind of this acknowledgement and lament, kind of a cover letter that Al Mohler, the president of the seminary, wrote, lamenting this. But then again, doesn't see any need to change anything. Doesn't need to won't even consider changing any of the names of the buildings. There was a Simmons College, an African American HBCU, said, look, if you really want to put your money where your mouth is, I mean, Southern has a huge endowment. And again, that endowment was originally contributed from plantation owners in South Carolina and Kentucky. So it's built with slave labor, both directly and indirectly. And when the question was raised, it's like, well, what if would you consider tithing your huge endowment and putting it toward a historically black institution? Mohler dismissed it out of hand and wouldn't even have a conversation about it. So, when it comes time, I think, to sort of do something to repair the damage and something that's going to be costly, I think that's where the real question of authenticity comes in. And at least by my lights, I think Southern's kind of failed that test.
Yeah, it seems like in a lot of ways we're very happy to know and understand and study, but then sometimes to get involved is seems like, I don't know, a bridge too far for some reason.
Well, it's costly, right? It involves money, it involves resources, and I think that's the biggest thing. But again, I do think about there's places in both the Old Testament and the New Testament of God saying, look, don't come to worship if you've got something between you and your brother or sister. Go take care of that first and then come to the altar, right? Get things right with them and then show up. That's the way to authentically, worship. And I think, that's more than just saying we're sorry. It's more than just sort of setting the record straight. But real repentance, always involves doing what we can to make things right. And so when we have big institutions with huge endowments that were directly, the beneficiaries of slave labor, it seems pretty straightforward that some sort of restitution's in order. And I think we're going to have those conversations if we're really serious about repentance.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and while we're on the subject too of seminaries, by definition, in order to have church go alongside with the racism, the racial hierarchy, the slavery of the day, we had to carve out space for white supremacy within our theology. But specifically in your book, you mentioned inerrancy, and I wanted to maybe see if you could flesh that out a little bit. How does that carving out affect the way that we use the traditional doctrine of inerrancy? And is there a more faithful, biblical, and perhaps liberating way to hold that doctrine?
Yeah, well, the challenge of inerrancy is, of course, no one's ever actually followed it. Right? That's the biggest challenge of that idea, that, we're not worried about mixing wool and cotton or polyester in our clothes. We're most white Christians aren't keeping kosher. So there's all that going on, and we're not selling our goods and giving them to the poor. We're hoarding our endowments, right? So let's kind of start there. But I think that the problem with it is that it kind of goes along with a very, I think, arrogant and defensive posture that sort of claims. You could think about. I could roll out for you, from my notes, kind of dig them out. How many of these folks, would make pronouncements like ones we see today that begin with, the Bible clearly teaches, fill in the blank. The biblical worldview mandates, fill in the blank.
Yeah, for sure.
That we're so clearly wrong, right?
Yeah.
That we're willing now to pronounce like, oh, no, owning another human being, that's not part of a biblical worldview. But we have to take seriously that the people who said that sincerely meant it. Right? And so I think that one of the things that gets us in trouble is that it sort of blocks challenges to a certain interpretation of the Bible, right? To our interpretation. Because if we can claim that our interpretation of the Bible is the straight reading of an inerrant text, it's unassailable, right? But that means that our own sinful prejudices, we've now protected our own sinful prejudices and presuppositions by a declaration that it's connected to inerrancy. So I think that that's been one of the biggest challenges is that particularly white Christians, I think, have been so ready and willing to pronounce that they have a hold on, not just that there is an inerrant text. That's one claim, but to claim that they know the meaning of that inerrant text, right? And that their interpretation of that inerrant text is the same thing as the inerrant text.
It's almost like where we're willing to source the infallibility in ourselves, and like without really prosecuting how, as the white Christians are interpreting this, like what do their slaves think about these texts, and what does history say about these texts, and what is the tradition of the church outside of America? How do they view these texts? Not that changes the meaning of the text itself, but it might inform us on something that we're missing that's in the text. Because I'm an inerrantist, but ultimately that to me is a freeing thing that causes me to continually question, is this just my culture I'm bringing in here, or am I actually getting what God was trying to communicate? I guess when I think about inerrancy, I think it's just such a historic kind of thing that goes back. To me, it seems bigger than America, even bigger even, I would say, than if you go back to the 1600s in Portugal and the beginning of slavery, the construction of race, and all those kind of things that happened around those times. And while men in their sin failed to come to a correct literal interpretation of the word, that still doesn't change or interact with really the underlying authority or inerrancy of the text itself as the revelation from God. Kind of descending from the high theology for a second, we think of our faith as defined by prominent leaders and their positions. So why is research into the way faith is practiced at the local church and parishioner level so critical?
I think it's critical because it's where, real lived Christianity is. In Catholicism and evangelical world and the mainline Protestant world. And one thing that shows up here is that the Catholic Church, for example, once a decade, beginning in the 40s, put out statements against racism. And they were pretty good. And it turns out that those statements never made it into sermons at the local level or into educational materials at the local level, and therefore have very little impact. The National Council of Churches has done virtually the same thing. It hasn't really made it into the mainline Protestant, into the pews or into local pastor sermons. So I think the kind of what's happening at the local level is really always where, real live Christianity is, and it's messier. Because I think, people who aren't theologians, who haven't been to seminary, tend to have less systematic ways of thinking about their faith. Now, they still live it out and they work hard to live faithfully. It's less an intellectual project, I think. And it's often like rife with inconsistencies, I think. And, the truth is all of our lives, are like that, right?
That's true.
Nobody's fully consistent. But I think paying attention to where it is there is a much better indication of, if we can put our hands around anything and call it American Christianity, I think we're better off trying to put our hands around the sum of individual believers and what they actually think and believe about the world than we are about doing some survey of, leaders and what they think and believe in the world. I think there's considerable, there's at least looseness in the joints, I would say, between those two points, if not outright contradiction sometimes.
Yeah, I really appreciate because it ties it back to what you were saying about being honest about the history in the church, because it's kind of a shattering thing to just encounter that. And it's like, well, what does my pastor know about this or anything like that? So I think it's definitely important, like you said earlier, as it relates to the local church, for leadership really to sink their teeth in and be honest with those that they govern.
Yeah, and I think our ecclesiology has always prized highly the local church, like the local church body. That's where everything happens. But by the very nature, a local church doesn't have like a long history of founders that's easily accessible like a seminary does, where you can just go back and say, oh, well, here's this person's presidency, and here's you're talking about thousands of thousands. So that's why I love the work that you've been doing, the work you've done in this book, the work at PRRI, because that is such valuable information for how we really live out faith, but it takes a lot of digging to get at it.
Yeah, it's complex, right? I think that's totally right. One thing I'll say on a lot of stuff we've been talking about, it's been fairly difficult, but on a hopeful note, I will say this: I don't think there's ever been a more important time to be a pastor of a local church. That is certainly not in my lifetime. It's also probably one of the most difficult times to be a pastor at a local church. I think both of those things are true, but I think this moment of reckoning is real on the issue of race. I think we've had these moments before, and they've been partially answered. But I think one way of thinking about the moment we're in is that we had this moment in the civil rights movement. Where King was. I remember Martin Luther King. He was. I think almost up until his death was optimistic that ultimately white Christians were going to see the injustices, were going to be convicted, and were going to rise up in mass and support the movement, and to try to level the playing field and to really purge, white supremacy from our midst. And it just never happened. There were little pieces here and there, but there was never any great accounting. And I think we're facing that again. And I think, you can't manufacture these opportunities. To put it in theological terms, I think, there are moments when the Spirit moves, right? And I think this is one of those moments. And when those moments arrive, I mean, we have an opportunity to take advantage of them, and move with it. And I think that there's an opportunity here for white Christians to really heal ourselves from this sickness that we've allowed, to kind of stay with us, and to hand something better down to our kids that they won't have to wrestle with in the same way that we have had to wrestle with it. So and that's why I think it is an exciting time. It's really hard, but if ever people needed spiritual leadership, spiritual guidance, and spiritual courage, I think it's now.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's so encouraging to hear. And I mean, we're reading, like you mentioned, Emerson, and you got Benia Silva, and even Kendi, who's like pretty practical about stuff. But your book does have that sense of hopefulness, and it's especially encouraging to me, coupled with the faith perspective of, like you said, the Spirit can do these things in us. So what hopefulness do you have? What kind of words would you have for folks who say, like, I would like to be part of the solution?
Yeah. Well, look, I went around toward the end of the book about, a lot of books tend to end with like, okay, so now you've read all this and here's the 10-step program to fix it.
Yeah, right.
And I really tried to resist that urge, not only because I don't have a 10-step program to fix it, but I don't think it's fixable in that way. But I did try to, lead with some case studies, and I was really inspired by these two Baptist churches in Macon, Georgia. Again, it's my parents' hometown. It's one of the reasons why I was hanging out there. I don't think by any means they're the only churches doing this, but it's it's the two churches that used to be one church and that split, one white, one black. And just in the last 7 years, I mean, the two pastors have decided to try to rebuild some community. They're not going to try to merge the churches. but they're just trying to kind of build some relationships and some community, and to try to acknowledge this very fraught history between the two. And it's required different things of different churches. I think in many ways, because of the history, it's been a more difficult journey for the white church, because they've had to be willing to, tell the truth about some really difficult things. But I think it's also been a pretty beautiful moment of growth for the white church. And I think that's the thing that I think many white Christians worry about what we're going to lose, both in sort of pride in our past or our heritage. But I think it's actually an opportunity for maturity, right, at the end of the day, to tell a more complex story that's true. That's true,
yeah.
And to get at it. And then ultimately to be free from protecting this mythical past that never was anyway, and to live into something that's more free and more real. And so I think it's been freeing for them to tell the truth about their past, but I think it's also been this moment of growth. I give just one example. When Dylan Roof killed 9 African Americans at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, the pastor of the white church, told me in an interview, he said, look, I'd like to think that our church would have been very sensitive to that moment, and that we would have had a service about it, and that we would have taught about it. We would have done Bible study around it. But if I'm honest, I don't know that we would have, had we not been in relationship with this other church. But because we had those relationships, it wasn't an abstract thing for us about whether we had some duty to talk about it, but we knew our fellow African-American brothers and sisters were hurting. And so it was not even a question that we had to address it, because we had people that we loved and cared about that we knew were hurting, and we needed to be in that space with them. And, and so they did. They held a service. The white church held one. They had a prayer together. But that's a moment of change. I think that had they not started this journey, it would have been a blip on the radar, probably for the white church, and it would have been something that resonated, for years in the black church, and it was one more way in which they saw the world differently. And instead, I think it turned out to be a way that they actually came together and continued to mend the fences.
Yeah, that's so beautiful, and it's real, and it's something we've been talking about with other guests as well, about how the relationships and the empathy and the care and the connecting, in a sense, of loving our neighbor.
Truly loving our neighbor, like fixes, like you said, it's not magic. There's not a 10-step program, but when we are desegregated in our culture, we can't not face these questions. And when we realize that it's not going to get fixed, a couple hundred years of inequality, injustice, inhumanity, that's not going to get fixed.
We know this. Sin doesn't just go away. It's atoned for, it's repented of, and then we have to walk in newness of life.
Yeah, put off and put on.
Put on.
Yeah.
We should get this.
Yeah. I'll make one more quick comment. I think that the posture, that it evokes also is so different. I think so often the posture of white Christians has been so defensive, right? It's been man the fortress, cross your arms, defend the territory. But I think entering into those relationships brings us much closer to, an openness and even, this idea, following the example of a kind of self-emptying Savior that isn't defending his turf, but he's laying out his life for the sake of others. And I think that's ultimately where building these relationships will take, I think, white Christianity, which is a much healthier place than the man the barricades mode that I think we see way too often.
Yeah.
That's good. So what, if somebody was interested in this, obviously, if you want to talk about the book, where can folks find you? Where can they find the book?
Yeah. Well, should be able to get the book, local bookstore, bookshop.com, which also supports local bookstores, or Amazon, or really anywhere else. And for the work of PRRI, we'll be doing more work, including work ahead of the election and kind of where kind of people of faith are on a whole range of issues around the election at prrri.org. And we also have a multiple times a week newsletter that's kind of our, we call it the Morning Buzz, which is kind of our kind of news with a shot of data that we give that again covers kind of the religion and politics space.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely link the Fractured Nation piece you put out recently as well in the show notes. Thought that was very eye-opening.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah.
Yeah, so much good work that you do, and I wish we had time to cover all of it in one episode.
One off-topic question, Robert. We typically ask our guests. This was such a heavy conversation. I feel like we need to decompress here for a second. When you're not doing very important, very heavy, very impactful, serious research, so we usually do a thing called substance shoutouts. Is there anything in the culture, arts and culture, that you could recommend of value? Yeah. Is there anything you've consumed that has been particularly encouraging or edifying lately?
Yeah, I tell you, it's going to be maybe an odd recommendation, but I've been watching the new version of Queer Eye. But I got to say though, it is often about building bridges across lines of difference, and I think with all the divisions in the country that we're feeling in so many directions, it felt like a kind of a breath of fresh air along those lines.
Well, there you go.
Nice.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for your time, and we'll probably mention this at the bumper here at the end that we'll record here in a second. But I also wanted to thank you and your publisher. We're going to be when this episode releases in the following week, we actually have 2 copies that Robbie and his team gave us to give away, so you can follow us on the socials to get a chance at winning that. So thank you again for that, and we appreciate your time, Robert.
Thanks, man. It was a great conversation. Thanks for having me. Have a good night.
Have a great evening.
Have a good evening.
All right, bye.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us for this great conversation.
That was an excellent conversation
with Robert P. Jones.
Robbie.
And Philip's going to give you some info on how you can get connected on the social. Keep the conversation going. I know we hit some controversial topics, and you're going to probably want to
Yeah, I look
interact.
forward to seeing Trevor's reactions to all the emails that are going to come in from this show. As far as staying up with us on the conversation, you can send us an email at thesubstancepod@gmail.com, or if you want to send us a voicemail, that's probably the best way to get on the show. Trevor, what's the number?
Yeah, send us a voicemail at 913-703-3883. It's just going to go straight to a recording, but give us your thoughts. That's a place where we can really hear your tone and your feeling on these things, because these are deep, meaningful, emotional topics.
Sure, and some of those we'll try to get on the show, and I think topic toss-ups might be a good place to revisit some of the better questions of these things going forward. You can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Follow us, and if you send us an email, also, if you would, a little bit of housekeeping here, let us know, like, a little bit about your demographics, whatever you're comfortable with, and how you heard about us, because these things, we're all coming from different backgrounds, and it's always interesting. We'd love to hear a little bit about you along with your input as well.
If you enjoy the content and you want to support us, there's 2 specific ways you can do that. The best one you can do is by subscribing and sharing this with anyone and everyone.
Tell your friends.
Tell your friends. Tell your housemates. Tell your neighbor. Give yourself a reason to talk to your next door neighbor.
Use a stranger on the street's phone. Say, hey, can I make a call? And then go to their podcast app and subscribe.
And then tell your house cat, and if you don't have one, you tell your neighbor's house cat.
All right.
And the second way you can support us is financially. But if you'd like to bless us with a little something, we are on Cash App at $thesubstancepod.
Boom.
We hope that you are getting your money's worth. Man, we thank you.
Amen.
I mean, it's free, so if they're not getting their money's worth for free.
Well, if it's worth your money, we hope you give us a little.
A little.
Well, that was a great conversation. So,
Man.
guys, and we're going to keep it coming. So we'll see you guys back next week.
On the substance.
We can start doing that. That could be a thing. I don't mind that. On the substance.
it's actually a much more theological conversation I usually get to have. So that's
no, I don't think Terry Gross is asking you the hard hitting theological questions.
Put me through my theological paces.